Greetings everyone, Kindly Kel here. In my previous video, I mentioned how Shadows of the Erdtree had been review bombed amid discussions about its difficulty. I wanted to expand on that in its own video. While it's true that the DLC is pretty hard, I don't think it's so overbearing that it would lead to such an intense backlash from a community that normally champions difficulty. So I thought we'd do a quick investigation on what could be the cause. Let's start by creating an understanding of how FromSoft uses difficulty in their games. Usually, they have some kind of barrier to entry for their titles. In the case of Dark Souls, the Asylum Demon is our barrier to entry, requiring the player to be smart enough to try to run away from a fight that they aren't able to win. Unfortunately, this wasn't quite enough of a tutorial on how to play the game, as once players figured out how to get past the encounter, many just returned to using brute force tactics. And upon arriving in Lordrun, our character is facing the path to New Londo. This will lead you to a hopeless encounter for a first-time playthrough. But that's likely intended, as the player can find a blacksmith down here to upgrade their weapons, should any enemies drop Titanite. The player is meant to die, then realize they need to come back later. The player's next logical assumption could be to investigate the ruins located within Firelink. This path will also lead to your death. Had the player internalized what they learned in the tutorial, they would know that both of these areas are meant to be returned to later. This isn't a jab at those players, of course, as I know very intelligent people who got stuck here. It's important to understand that many players were sold on the marketing of Dark Souls. Prepare to die. Meaning, when they came to these areas that were meant for a higher level, they just assumed that it was the experience they paid for, and they didn't like it. The marketing of Dark Souls put players in the wrong mindset for the game. It's also worth noting, after Dark Souls 2, From Software's publishing partners seem to have stopped pushing difficulty as a marketing tool, and I suspect it's a result of incidents like these. This approach of letting players learn from dying isn't new to FromSoft. They've been doing this for years. Let's take a look at the Souls predecessor to see it in action. No, not Demon Souls. Kingsfield. Released in 2001, Kingsfield 4, The Ancient City, presents the player with two paths immediately in front of them. One path will lead you to a collapsing floor that kills you, and it also has stronger enemies beyond it. While the other path will lead you to a friend and a weapon. You can see the pattern forming. FromSoft allows the players to explore and die at their leisure, but expects you to turn back and go the easier route. It creates a sense of independence, reinforces the brutality of the world, and it gives you an obvious way to overcome the challenge, just by having one hard direction and one intended direction. This is probably why they still use this approach. Now, on to Elden Ring. FromSoft's best-selling title so far. We are immediately dumped in a church and thrown into an encounter designed to kill the player. Upon defeat, we're teleported to the actual tutorial, and it prevents us from bashing our heads against that first boss. The enemies of the tutorial are all trivially easy compared to that first encounter, giving us an expectation of what basic combat should actually feel like. Then, once we reach the surface, we're greeted by another enemy we aren't meant to overcome yet. A test to see if you learned anything. This enemy is beyond you right now, so come back later. I was able to win by exploiting my knowledge of the posture mechanics, but we have to admit that the player clearly isn't intended to win this encounter yet. From here, if the player follows the guidance of Grace, they'll be railroaded to Margit, who will then lay the player's ambitions to rest. Margit functions as a wall, preventing the player from accessing content they aren't prepared for. It's critical that he's at the start of the level, as it prevents the player from feeling any sense of commitment to exploring the area. FromSoft went above and beyond in their efforts to teach the player this time around. Now, let's take a look at Shadows of the Erdtree. We are met with an open field, rather than a boss that's expected to kill us. After reaching the end of the field, we're presented with two paths. One takes us to Belarus, where I imagine many players went first. Here we have a medium-sized legacy dungeon that isn't too much of a step up in difficulty from Leandel. There's one or two enemies that may give us some trouble, but there's no Margit-like encounter to stop our progress. That is, until we reach the end of the dungeon. The Divine Beast Dancing Lion is a massive step up in difficulty compared to the area that it's located in. The barrier to entry is located at the very end of the dungeon rather than at the start. This gives players the assumption that they're doing something wrong during the boss fight, rather than they need to return later. Worse yet, the site of grace for the fight is only a few steps away from the boss. This is practically an invitation for the player to throw themselves into a meat grinder. Rather than impressing upon the player that they need to explore and gather the Shadow Tree fragments, Shadows of the Erdtree seems to have accidentally created psychological traps for players to get stuck in. Perhaps FromSoft didn't feel inclined to re-tutorial the player on the importance of exploring, since the DLC requires you to have beaten an end-game boss. However, many players returning likely hadn't played the game in as long as 2 years. And in my opinion, a lot of headache could have been avoided for these players had they impressed the importance of exploring the Lands of Shadow first. At the end of the day, it's on the player to not corner themselves in an open world game. But mentally preparing the player for an experience is something that all games do, whether you're aware of it happening or not. And I think that FromSoft could have done a slightly better job in that regard. Of course, this doesn't account for all the player base's complaints, some of which are very valid, like the final boss being a bit too much and the DLC story causing some lore retcons. But I don't think these issues are proportional to the negative reviews. If you had a hard time with the DLC, I urge you to take a break, come back refreshed, and be a bit more open to just exploring the Lands of Shadow. You might just have a good time. Thank you for your time. Did you have any trouble with Shadows of the Erdtree? Let me know below. Until next time. And until then...
Don't you dare go on,